Director and the entire Lex Lata Center for giving me the opportunity, this opportunity this afternoon. And I want to say a big welcome, and it's really nice to have you all here. So before I get into the business of this afternoon, I want to remind you to please kindly mute writing pads ready. It's going to be a really enlightening session. I just want to confirm, can everyone hear me? You can just type in the chat box, please. Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much. So now thank you so much. We would get right into the business of today. So this afternoon, I have with me two amazing guests that are joining us, and they would be taking us through some aspects of the concept of unconstitutional changes of government. And they are Ms. Adebanke Ilori and Chibuike Njoku. So not to waste so much of our time, let me so thank you very much for joining me here this afternoon. Good afternoon, Adebanke.
Good afternoon, Ewalua. Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you for joining me this afternoon. It's really nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much. So right now we'll just get into the business of today. And Adebanke would be speaking to us about unconstitutional changes of government in Africa and their implications for democracy on the continent. So before she begins, I would like to read a citation so that you get to know some things about her. Adebanke Ilori Oyeniyi is a lawyer and development professional with professional experience spanning across politics, inclusive governance, and legislative reforms. Currently, she serves as the executive director of Raising New Voices Initiative, a non-governmental organization in Nigeria. And she also serves as the managing director of Lawyered NG, a platform for interactions around the practice of law in Nigeria. In 2019, Adebanke led Raising New Voices Initiative to conduct the National Break the Hold campaign, providing resources to competent young people under 35 contesting to be members of the Federal House of Representatives. As a woman in politics, she was in 2019 appointed as the National Publicity Secretary of COA Party, making her the youngest female to occupy that position in Nigeria. As a Pan-African, she has facilitated extensive deliberations at the African Union on the importance of youth integration in the actualization of Agenda 2063, particularly for the promotion of intracontinental trade. Adebanke obtained a bachelor's degree in law from Obafemi Awolowo University, Ile-Ife, Nigeria, and a master's in international development and policy at the University of Chicago. She also holds a certificate in global conflict studies from the same institution and a certificate in public management from Bridgewater State University, Massachusetts. She is a 2019 Mandela Washington Fellow, and she sits on the boards of various non-governmental organizations in Nigeria. Please kindly join me. I want to see your energy in the chat box, please. Please kindly join me as I welcome Adebanke Ilori to the virtual center stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you, Titi Lope. Thank you. I'm so honored to be here today, and I'd like to thank the organizers, first Ewalua, for reaching out to me to be a part of this, and to also thank the entire Lex Lata Center team. I think that this is a very important discussion to have in the light of what has been happening on our continent and in Nigeria, West Africa, and the continent at large. So I'm really delighted to be part of this conversation. So I know that it's going to be a short seminar, so I'm just going to go right into it. I would like to start by a quote that I like. There are a lot of democracy quotes, right? The one I feel it's most suited for this conversation today is the one by Michael Moore, where he said that democracy is not a spectator sport, it's a participatory event. If we don't participate in it, it ceases to be a democracy. And I believe that that is very suited for where we are today in terms of unconstitutional changes of government and its implications for democracy in Africa, because we have seen a lot of changes in terms of what unconstitutional changes of government is. Typically, the first thought that would come to mind would be, oh, coup d'etat, and its implications, military takeovers, and all of that. And but what we'll see is that, especially in the light of recent international law framework, particularly in the African Union and the ECOWAS, we'll see that it's not just about the coup d'etats now. It now can be defined as inventions by mercenaries to replace a democratically elected government. It could also be a replacement of a democratically elected government by armed dissident groups and rebel movements. It could also be the refusal by an incumbent government to relinquish power to the winning party after winning free and fair elections. And of course, it could be a coup d'etat. And I believe that the most suited to our situation in Nigeria, now using the Nigerian context, is that we see a lot of challenges in terms of our framework around political participation and elections in Nigeria, particularly with respect to free and fair elections, credible elections, strengthening our political parties and our electoral management body, that's INEC. And that in itself weakens the framework and denies the people the opportunity to be a part of the democratic process. So when we see instances where the elections are not free, fair, and transparent, where the people's voices are not heard in terms of elections, we can consider it to be a form of unconstitutional change of government. It might not be a coup d'etat or taken over by, or the government being taken over by armed dissidents, but based on the fact that the government and political office holders are supposed to derive their power from the people. When that doesn't happen, we can consider that to be within the framework of an unconstitutional change of government. And particularly coming to Nigeria, Nigeria has had 9 coups so far. Hopefully that's all we would have. By God's grace, we wouldn't be going back to the military era. The first one was in January 1966, as we're all aware. And now what we see is that while we do not experience military coups anymore, we see an oppression and disregard for the rule of law. We see forms of voter suppression. We see a manipulation of our political system in terms of retention of political power amongst the select few. A case in point is the fact that if we look at the political structure in Nigeria today, we'll see that it's the same set of people who have been ruling for years past. The people who ruled in the military era are still the same set of people. We haven't really seen at the emergence of new faces. It's like, they said that the political office holders dropped their car keys and wore agbadas, literally, and that's what we see happening. I think since I returned to democracy, only one of our presidents wasn't a military office holder. So you see how that might not augur well for a growing and budding democracy. We also see situations where elections are rigged by the incumbent government. And most recently, we've also seen a refusal for legislative reforms, particularly in terms of having an electoral act that really reflects the wishes of the people and the peculiarities of the times. So we've seen that there have been challenges in that regard. And the implication, and going to the African context now, we'll see also that the continent has really witnessed a lot of coup d'etats. Nearly 3/4 of African leaders who left power between the 1960s and 1970s did so through violent coup d'etats or assassinations. And in the 1980s, this figure dropped below 70%. And by 1990s, it was surpassed by the share of those who died through natural causes, or who left government through natural causes rather, who voluntarily resigned or through electoral defeat. So that was a research done by Posa and Young in 2007. So we see that transition of power in Africa has been done more by violent coup d'etats or assassinations, and fewer numbers of transition of powers have occurred through the proper due process of elections. And we'll see that the continent is witnessing a new wave of democracy, and thankfully things have been changing since 1996, particularly with respect to how the regional bodies and how the African Union and how the regional bodies are beginning to speak to issues and try to ensure that we see good governance, and we see a commitment from the multilateral organizations now to the good tenets of democracy and elections. And what I want us to also notice is that West Africa accounts for 44.4% of the coups in the African region. That's a large number. I could share my slides later with Ewolua to share with everyone via email. But this is a very high number, and it doesn't augur well for the future of the region, so to say. And what's the implication of unconstitutional change of government, really? I mean, why not? Some people have said, oh, maybe Africa shouldn't be democratic. Maybe we prefer autocracy. Maybe that's what we need. Our culture doesn't allow for constitutional change of government, you know. And I think that we need to, when we talk about issues like that, we need to explore the nexus between democracy and development, and what happens when a country is democratic and is stable. The fact that economic development can occur, and the investor confidence that it boosts, particularly as Africa and West African region is trying to promote FDIs and actually boost investor confidence. So when there's instability, when there's political instability, when investors do not know who the new president will be tomorrow, you know, when coups are always occurring, then that doesn't particularly promote confidence in your country, because people don't want to invest in an unstable place, you know, because they never can tell what will happen tomorrow. You know, they never can tell who the president will be in the next month. So it impacts on the level of development that we can experience as a continent. Of course, sometimes we also see that there are sanctions imposed by foreign countries that will do businesses. So I remember that in Zimbabwe, the last time they had some challenges in their elections, some countries placed economic sanctions, which wouldn't usually affect those political leaders, because those ones can leave the country to get healthcare somewhere else, if it's like some sort of sanctions in terms of access to healthcare. But it really impacts on the people of that country. So that's also an example of how unconstitutional change of government impacts on the African people. Then it also promotes marginalization of citizens and their human rights, because the idea of democracy is that everyone has a voice and an opportunity to contribute to the development, to the political dynamics of their country. So when unconstitutional changes of government happen, we see that people's voices are silent. We see a marginalization of the demands of the people. We see that the rule of law is set aside. Then we also see that the electoral management bodies, the INECs of these countries, cannot really develop capacity to deliver on its responsibilities. So that's also a challenge that occurs when unconstitutional change of government happens. Then we see a disregard of human rights, because of course, when people's voices are not heard, then there's a disrespect for the rule of law and a disregard for human rights. I've mentioned the impact on economic growth and FDIs as well. We also see a global impact, you know, from the international development perspective. The fact that Africa, some parts of Africa are still trying to get the process of peaceful transition of power rights doesn't speak well for us in the global arena. So it's like, you're trying to get the UN Security Council and everyone's like, you guys should better go get your act together first in your continent before coming to say you want to be a leader on a global scale. So in terms of how the perception of Africa as a continent on a global platform, unconstitutional change of government also impacts on that. So I think that the solutions that I would, not I think, the solutions that I would propose is to continue to engage regional bodies. For example, I know that the African Union has in recent times been very strong in defining what unconstitutional change of government is, and also saying this is and also rejecting it in instances where it has occurred. For example, the African Union has the Lomé Declaration of the year 2000. There's the AU Constitutive Act, and there's the response to unconstitutional change of government. And the ECOWAS also has the Democracy and Good Governance Protocol. This came into place in 2001. And the AU Constitutive Act provides that governments which come into power through unconstitutional means shall not be allowed to participate in the activities of the Union. And it also promotes the reestablishment of a constitutional government within 6 months. And you see that the ECOWAS, for example, I must at this point praise the ECOWAS. Despite their limitations, they've been able to promote the principles of constitutional change of government. So we'll see what they did in Gambia and how they ensured that the voice of the people prevailed. And ECOWAS has suspended Niger, Togo, and Cote d'Ivoire in times past. It even suspended Guinea and Mali. But the concern usually now would be how sustainable are these measures and the long-term impact of these measures. Because sometimes we see that the people that would suspend, most African countries are still facing the challenges of having a strong man in power. So it's like the pot is calling the kettle black, and that affects the ability of the African Union and the ECOWAS to continue a sustained effort in terms of speaking against unconstitutional change of government. So, and in the Nigerian context, we know that our constitution says that sovereignty belongs to the Nigerian people. That section 14 of the 1999 constitution protects our democracy outrightly. And as such, we've been able to prevent coup d'etat, to a certain extent with the support of the Nigerian people, civil society organizations, and international development partners who have been promoting principles of good governance within the country. And I just want to also, oh, my time. Okay, I'm trying to keep within the time frame that has been given to me, and I see some charts here. Okay, it's not a chart telling me to round up. I just thought that maybe Ewa was like, banker, finish up. And so what? I'm trying to keep within the time allotted to me. So coming to the present day context, as I've said, the AU has come a long way in terms of promoting constitutional change of government, particularly with respect to the laws that the framework that has been established. AU prior to 1996 wasn't this responsive, but so far they've been able to, add their voices to a number of issues. Even the ECOWAS has been so responsive, but we must identify the limitations that occur for these regional bodies. The political dynamics, the fact that there's always one external actor impacting on things. We see sometimes colonial history impacting on elections and determination of some stakeholders to not amplify the voices of people, to hinder the people from actually speaking out to what they want. So we see all those political dynamics come into place in the AU and ECOWAS context. So we also see economic or strategic interests coming into place. Sometimes the AU and ECOWAS, they want to do more, but their hands are tied because it's the people that they are speaking against that are in charge. There's only so much that they can do, and sometimes we see a lack of cohesion in terms of what the African Union is saying and what the ECOWAS is saying, we see that the AU has taken this certain step. The ECOWAS has come out strongly to speak against something, but the AU is not as strong, to condemn action. So that is also a challenge that we need to face. And we also see some voices, saying that Africa is not suitable for democracy. We are this, we are that. But to those kind of voices, I like to respond to what has been termed the utility of democracy, and the impact of democracy in building sustainable development and promoting change, enduring change. Fine, we may be able to record some levels of economic successes if we're to be autocratic, but the truth is that we haven't been able to do that as a continent. That's the first thing I want us to know. The second thing is that in an environment where there's a lot of political instability, we are unable to sustain whatever progress if we think that, oh, this person comes in now and does this for 2 years, somebody else comes in and interrupts it. And the interruption in the governance process continues to limit the amount of development that we can have as a continent. So I think that when we examine the utility of democracy and its impact on the continent, I believe that democracy is the right way to go, and unconstitutional change of governance should be discouraged in African countries. I also want to talk about the roles of citizens and CSOs. Your democracy is only as good as you make it as a people, which is why I appreciate this kind of conversations that we have, particularly the one being sponsored by the Lex Lata Center, and the work that other CSOs do in terms of political inclusion, the work we do at New Voices in terms of political inclusion. It is very important for citizens to get involved. And I remember and I would like to refer to the Gambian experience in this regard, and how the people just kept saying, we are not going to have Yaya Jame. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name well. Yaya Jame just had to leave because he saw that, there was a lot of pressure from his people, from the ECOWAS, from the international community. So it is important for us as citizens to continue to speak against all forms of unconstitutional change of government. In Nigeria, like I said, we might not have had a coup d'etat in recent years, but we still have a lot of challenges to our constitution in terms of peaceful transition of power. We still have electoral violence. We still have absence of lack of inclusion. We still have exclusion and marginalization of some voices. Those are things that impact on the constitutional change of government. So I would always refer to the fact that your democracy is only as good as you make it as a people. And there's actually no perfect democracy. Democracy and good governance is a journey of continuous and never-ending improvement. So if you go to sleep today, I don't know who said it, but there's a quote that says eternal vigilance is the price you pay for a good democracy. So you always have to shine your eyes as we say in our local parlance. I'd like to also conclude that the AU and multilateral bodies can do more, but we need to also support them. We as a people, we as civil society organizations, always holding them accountable to ensure that they have proactive measures that prevent any form of recession of democracy. I think that the truth is that nation building and state building is a very long journey. It's not a one-time thing. It's not even something we would achieve in 20 years. We can see, for example, with what has happened in Afghanistan recently. The US was there for 20 years and they leave, and within like a month, everything falls apart. So state building is not something you can achieve based on the support of international community. It's not something they will support us, they are supporting us. The AU is doing what they can do within the limited framework that they have. The ECOWAS is doing some things as well, but ultimately, power belongs to the people, and the people should always look for measures to protect the sanctity of the electoral process and prevent unconstitutional change of government. So thank you so much for your time and for listening to me. I don't know if you can take questions, or that will be at the end of the session. Thank you, Ewolua.
Thank you so much, Adebanke. That was a very insightful session. And I totally agree with the fact that we are actually the ones responsible for preserving the sanctity of democracy on our continent. Um, there's a question on my mind, though. I just want to know what you think about some scholars that have come up recently that are arguing in favor of good coups. Like there are some, there are actually sometimes when probably the military overthrows the sitting government, and even the citizens come out to rejoice. And there are actually sometimes where, of course, there's an argument with the people are suffering and they actually need like a savior at that moment. So some scholars have actually argued that there are a few aspects of unconstitutional changes of government that can actually be encouraged on the continent. So what do you think of this argument?
Okay, so I did mention the utility of democracy, and that's my own point of view in terms of good coup. I'm usually concerned when people feel like they know what is good for the people. Look at Libya, for example. Now Gaddafi is out, and like, the continent, that country hasn't been able to recover from it. Did the people rejoice when Gaddafi died? Yes. Was Gaddafi a perfect leader? Of course, absolutely not. He had his own challenges, but I don't think that interrupting a process is the best thing, because that process, the process of nation building, the process of state building, has to happen. So every time we interrupt it, we're just postponing the evil days, so to say, or we're just, we're taking a longer route to development. So when you say, oh, this person has come in now, good coup happens, the government tries to get itself together for the next 2 years. Before the government finishes getting itself together, another good coup happens. How can a country develop, or how can a continent even develop when every two years somebody is coming up to say, that guy is a bad guy, I'm going to take him out? These things take time, and that's my point of view when we say, oh, this is a good coup. If these people are really of good intentions, immediately after the coup occurs, let them set up a framework for elections for the will of the people to materialize. But we see that that is not usually the case. Everyone is trying to get power for himself or herself, although women don't really participate in coups, but so when people say stuff like a good coup and something, I don't agree, because I believe in the principle of the utility of democracy and the boundless potentials that it holds. I don't think people are okay with you telling them what to do, and this is how you guys should do your things. And that's what coups do most of the time, when they say, oh, this guy is a bad guy, this guy is a this guy. Okay, you guys have overthrown the person, organize elections. How many times do we actually see them organize elections? Because they now come and say, well, the good guys, we're going to fix everything. And they end up making things worse. So that's my opinion to that.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anyone have any other question? Okay, in the absence of no other question, we have come to the end of your session, Adebanke. Thank you so much for the very educative session that we had. I learned a lot, and I'm sure others learned too. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So, okay, now we'll be moving on to the next session, and I'm going to be inviting Mr. Chibuike Njoku. Good afternoon, Mr. Njoku.
Yeah, good afternoon.
How are you doing this afternoon?
Yeah, can you see me? I'm doing fine.
Yeah, it's really nice. Fine. It's really nice to have you here.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Okay, so before he begins, I would like to read his citation. Emmanuel Chibuike Njoku is a lawyer with specialization in democracy, human rights, and governance. Following his graduation from the University of the Gambia in 2016, he worked as a legal intern at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, where he handled human rights violation communications. He holds a BL from the Nigerian Law School and a Master of Laws degree in Human Rights and Democratization in Africa from the University of Pretoria. where he won the Dean's Prize and the 2020 Ubuntu Award for the students who best captured the values of humanity. At present, Chibuike is a professional assistant at the African Union ECOSOC, where he works to promote and defend a culture of good governance, democratic principles and institutions, popular participation, human rights and freedoms. He was part of the African Union observation mission to the Republic of Zambia regarding its recently concluded presidential elections. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Chibuike Ojukwu as the session now. I would like to see your energy in the chat box.
Okay, thank you, moderator. I want to especially thank the Lex Lata Institute for having me on this platform today. The issue of unconstitutional change of government, I just want to confirm if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you clearly. Okay.
So the issue of unconstitutional change of government is a very, very necessary conversation to have in this time and age, especially since the wave of democratization in Africa, talking about the early 90s all the way down to this very moment. We are still in our democratic process, and we are very hopeful, even at the African Union, that a lot of strides have been covered in this continental move to institutionalizing democracy and good governance within the fabric of governance in Africa. So going down to my task, which is to talk about the African Union mechanisms for combating unconstitutional change of government. I would ordinarily have preferred to have a PowerPoint presentation, but I would just speak to the topic without a presentation, and I hope you can bear with me. The African Union has the legal and policy framework to addressing the issue of unconstitutional changes of government, or UCG, as we call it here. And they also have the institutional framework for handling these issues as well. So we start by talking about the African Union's legal and policy frameworks. In this regard, the AU has what we call, I think the co-panelists talked about the declaration on the framework for an OAU response to unconstitutional changes of government. That is what we call here the Lomé Declaration, and this was adopted in the year 2000 in the Togolese capital of Lomé. And also we have a second instrument called the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, which was adopted in Addis Ababa in January 2007. And the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance is a little more elaborate than the Lomé Declaration in particular regard to identifying the different manifestations or demonstrations or situations that ordinarily would pass for an unconstitutional change of government in Africa. So the second instrument, that's the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, is what we call also the Addis Ababa Charter. And finally, we have the African Union Constitutive Act, which is the enabling instrument, or the instrument basically creating the African Union, or its predecessor, the Organization of African Unity. So let's go down and unpack the content of these legal instruments or these policy instruments as it relates to the issue at hand. The Lomé Declaration and Addis Ababa Charter both consider situations that can be classified to fall under the UCG, that is the unconstitutional change of government. And these four critical situations are identified in these two African Union documents. And it says, number one, it says the instance where there's a military coup d'etat against a democratically elected government. And number two, intervention by mercenaries to replace a democratically elected government. Number three says the replacement of a democratically elected government by armed dissidents and rebel movements. And number four says the refusal by an incumbent government to relinquish power to the winning political party after a free, fair, and regular election. And this number 4 is actually very striking because we saw this particular instance play out in the Gambia. And funny enough, I will be making a lot of mention to the issue of the Gambia because in the year when the political impasse happened in Gambia, I was there live. I was with the African Commission at the time. So we witnessed these things firsthand. But we saw that in that case, the incumbent president who had served for 22 years, Yahya Jammeh, after the elections, he considered even on live TV and called his the opposition candidate, and like President Jonathan of Nigeria did, he congratulate him and wish him well in his government. But some days later, the president revoked that concession. Like said, no, that the election was marred by irregularities and he's not going to relinquish power until the Supreme Court sits on the matter. So this particular instance falls, according to the Addis Ababa Charter, falls under what we would consider to be an unconstitutional change of government. Although, I mean, it was an attempt, it wasn't successful because eventually the ECOWAS forces, what we call the ECOWAS military intervention in Gambia, or the ECOWAS mission in the Gambia, intervened eventually, and he fled to the Republic of Equatorial Guinea. So yes, when an incumbent refuses to acknowledge the result and he sustains or tries to perpetuate himself in power after credible elections have shown that he lost clearly, it's considered under the African Union Charter, the Addis Ababa Charter, to be an unconstitutional change of government. And furthermore, the Addis Ababa Charter in Article 23, paragraph 5, adds a fifth situation that we would consider to be a UCG situation. And it says any amendment or revision of the constitution or legal instruments which is an infringement on the principles of democratic change of government. So where a dictator or a despot unilaterally changes the constitution or a legal instrument, or even the parliament make an illegal move to change the constitution in a way that infringes the principles of the democratic change of government, the African Union legal instruments consider this to constitute an unconstitutional change of government. And we know also that these instruments have also expressly, just to state clearly that the African Union unequivocally denounces, we condemn cases of UCG with a lot of times, in fact, even before the coming into force or before the declaration, the Lomé Declaration in 1996, 1997, when the coup d'etat happened in the Republic of Sierra Leone. That was even the first time ever the African Union took a unanimous stand against unconstitutional change of government in Africa. And I think if it's argued within scholars that are focused on this subject, that that's coup d'etat in Sierra Leone, which happened just before the African Union General Assembly meeting, could have been the inspiration behind the declaration in Lomé. So yes, the UCGs are considered by the Lomé Declaration, and I quote, as an unacceptable and anachronistic act, which is in contradiction of our commitment to promote democratic principles and conditions. And again, the Addis Ababa Preamble in its paragraph 6 also states in condemnation of unconstitutional change of government that about the unconstitutional changes of government that are one of the essential causes of insecurity, instability, and violent conflict in Africa. Now let's look at what the African Union Constitutive Act has to say about unconstitutional changes of government. The African Union, the Act of African Union provides what we call foundational principles of AU measures to promote democratic values, including the condemnation, of course, of UCGs in Africa. And a very interesting aspect of the African Union Constitutive Act, Article 4 particularly, states that the African Union shall function in accordance with, says in paragraph M, respect for democratic principles, human rights, rule of law, and good governance. And paragraph O, the letter O, says respect for the sanctity of human life, condemnation and rejection of impunity and political assassination, acts of terrorism and subversive activities, I mean to say. And finally, the paragraph P says condemnation and rejection of unconstitutional changes of governments. And again, Article 30 of the African Union Constitutive Act provides that governments which shall come to power through unconstitutional means shall not be allowed to participate in the activities of the African Union. So you see, it is as clear as it can be that governments that come illegitimately cannot be recognized, number one, and they cannot be allowed to participate in the processes or the decision-making procedures of the African Union. And you see, to give effect to this principled position of the African Union, a lot of practical, a good number of practical actions have been put in place by the African Union as a standard response to cases of unconstitutional changes of government in Africa. And if you check the trend of UCGs in Africa since perhaps, let's say, since 2000, since the Lome Declaration to date, you see these practical actions playing out in this exact succession. So the first action that the African Union typically carries out when these incidents happen, say a government has been unconstitutionally removed, is that the first action is that the African Union chairperson or the president of the African Union Commission, on behalf of the organization, immediately and publicly condemns the act of the UCG. And of course, he urges for a speedy return of constitutional order in the country concerned, as well as urging the consistency of actions at the bilateral, interstate, and sub-regional and international levels as well. Afterwards, what happens next after the condemnation? I feel like we've seen this as well happen on the TV a lot, seeing the headlines, African Union condemns, say, the coup in Mali or in Zimbabwe, or which other country have recent coups recently. We always start with the condemnation first, and then afterwards we have the African Union Peace and Security Council convene an emergency meeting to discuss the matter at hand, and also to agree on the necessary measure, punitive measure, sanctions to implement or to impose on the state concerned, and also to see if this is a situation that will warrant us within the framework of our enabling treaty to impose sanctions. And afterwards, the country concerned would be suspended from participation in the policy organs of the African Union, while the perpetrators of the UCG are given a period of up to 6 months to restore constitutional order in the country. And the AU, again, within these 6 months, tries to hold diplomatic engagements with the perpetrators of the coup, in the case of the Gambia, it was ECOWAS engaging with the president who refused to relinquish power. So there's a form of diplomatic engagement, which also features, what we call the committee of eminent persons. So in addition, I mean to say, to past head of state and present serving heads of state, I mean to say, we also invite eminent persons, be it popular figures in Africa, to support the mission, the diplomatic mission, to speak with the perpetrators of the UCG with a view to finding an end to the impasse. And also sometimes we also invite the regional economic communities like ECOWAS, I mean to say, to assist us in this diplomatic process. And afterwards, at the expiration of this 6 months suspension period, a range of limited and targeted punitive measures or sanctions imposed against the state, where the state refuses or the perpetrators refuse to reinstate constitutional order in the country concerned. And these sanctions vary from, be it visa denial for perpetrators or restriction of government to government contacts. And this is a part where African Union encourages its member states to bilaterally break a severe or limit its relationship with its state concern. So yeah, they restrict government to government contact and trade restrictions as well. And also they implement some economic sanction regimes against the state concerned. But also mind you that these sanction regimes are also we apply them cautiously so that the ordinary citizens of the country don't suffer for the wrongs of the perpetrators. And furthermore, the Article 25 of the Addis Ababa Charter provides about 4 extra measures that the African Union typically should implement in the case of a UCG. And the 4 additional measures include that the African Union and the Peace and Security Council must disallow what we call automatic legitimization by the coup plotters or the coup makers. So what this means is that the African Union, through its Peace and Security Council, must ensure that when the democratic order or constitutional order is restored, the coup plotters or perpetrators are prohibited from either participating in the elections, the democratic elections, or holding public offices. And again, the African Union, another extra sanction or policy includes that provision for sanctioning of member states that foment or support unconstitutional change of government in another member state. So these are provisions that are not seen in the Lomé Declaration or the African Union Constitutive Act. So these are exclusive to the Addis Ababa Charter. And again, they impose an obligation as well on member states to refuse to grant asylum or to receive perpetrators of UCG in Africa. And again, finally, the last provision also encourages member states to sign bilateral agreements that touch on legal instruments on extradition and mutual legal assistance in the case where a perpetrator of unconstitutional change of government runs into another state and he needs to be extradited to the state where he carried out his unconstitutional act. So I just want to state a few cases since 2010 of successful coups in Africa and how the African Union has also implemented this procedure I highlighted. So we see in 2010, there was a coup in Niger, in Mali 2012, in Guinea 2012, in the Central African Republic in 2013, Egypt in 2013, Burkina Faso in 2015, Sudan in 2019, and Mali most recently in August last year, 2020. In these cases, since 2010, we've seen the African Union condemn the coup plotters, also convening the PSC, that's the Peace and Security Council meetings, and then subsequently suspending the government from participation in the African Union processes. And there's a very outstanding case that happened in 2017. And if you can remember, when the government of Robert Mugabe was removed, it was a very interesting development because in this case, the African Union did not suspend Zimbabwe. And the reason being that the coup plotters were also very strategic in their plot. They arrested the president, held him in house arrest for a while, and they refused to name it a coup, so to speak. And they allowed Mugabe time to, voluntarily resign from office, just to give it a semblance of, okay, Mugabe resigned. This was not a coup. This was just, we had to pressure him to resign. So just giving a semblance of, following constitutional order, but we know that this was a coup. But African Union in this case could not suspend Zimbabwe because there was a semblance of, following the constitution because the president was not removed. He resigned himself. So in this case, we could say that Zimbabwe escaped the suspension wrath of the African Union. Then we have institutional frameworks. Beyond the legal framework, we have also institutions that touch on, through which we combat the issue of UCGs in Africa. And one very critical institution in this regard within the African Union system is the African Union Peace and Security Council, which was established in the year 2002. And the Article 7 of the protocol creating the Peace and Security Council, that's what we call the PSC, empowers the PSC to institute sanctions whenever an unconstitutional change of government takes place in member states as provided in the Lomé Declaration. So the PSC can impose sanctions. So whenever you see news headlines that African Union has, imposed sanctions on the junta government of this country, Mali or Burkina Faso, or any country at all, what they're simply saying is that the African Union Peace and Security Council has done this. So that is an organ of African Union that takes care of issues that threaten peace and security in Africa. And they're the ones that impose these sanctions of the African Union in the case of UCGs in Africa. And also another very critical aspect of African Union or institution of within the African Union system that is very critical is also what we call the regional economic communities. And I think the former speakers addressed this issue. The regional economic communities like ECOWAS, we have the SADC for the Southern Africa region, we have the EAC, the East African Community, They are very, very important partners, and they are closely integrated into the African Union's system and the work of the African Union. In fact, we properly identify the RECs, we call them the RECs, the Regional Economic Communities, the RECs as the building blocks of the African Union. They are the arm, basically the eyes, the arm, the leg of the African Union, in the sense that when issues happen, even before the African Union intervenes, the regional economic communities are almost like the first responders because of their proximity to their member states. And also in many systems as well, like in the East African system, the regional economic community, which is the EAC, the East African community, they share a lot of cultural and political similarities. So they best understand their situations, and they're also the best people to help the African Union carry out its mandate. So we need the regional economic communities. We call them the partners, the building blocks of the African Union. And we've had a very recent case where the regional economic community stepped into a case that would otherwise would have been, a case of UCG in West Africa. And that was in Gambia in 2016, 2017, when President Jammeh refused to relinquish power. ECOWAS, the African Union Peace and Security Council, held a meeting, and they approved basically the ECOWAS proposed intervention in Gambia, what we call ECOMIG, ECOWAS military intervention in Gambia, or ECOWAS mission in the Gambia. So ECOWAS, the AUPS, the PSC approved, and then ECOWAS also stepped in following of course, the member state resolution. So that was a case where the RECs helped African Union to step in and prevent what would have been an unconstitutional change of government. And in conclusion, it's apparent that just one more thing, like African Union also we use the avenue of member states, trying to get member states to cut off, bilateral relationships with these states where these things have happened. So member states are very critical to our move against UCGs in Africa. So, but in conclusion, it's very, very obvious, of course, that there are regulatory norms and principles that are increasingly being inscribed into the democracy and governance architecture of the African Union. And the primary aim, of course, is to deter any form of unconstitutional change of government across the continent. And just have a few recommendations, of course, would be to promote constitutionalism within the AU system. States should embrace constitutionalism. And again, there should be ratification of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. Out of the African Union 55 member states, I think it's just about 34 that have ratified this instrument. And this instrument also gives us a legal basis to intervene and to impose sanctions. So we need other states to ratify this particular treaty. And again, finally, there should be a greater collaboration and harmonization of policies between the African Union and the regional economic communities, as the likes of ECOWAS, EAC, and SADC, because there's a friction in the implementation of policies has led to some intervention debacles, fiasco, like we saw in Togo in 2005 and in Ivory Coast in 2010. In the particular Togo case, African Union and ECOWAS agreed to withdraw recognition to this particular government that came in unlawfully. But when the government agreed, the president, the guy that came into power, that assumed power, it unlawfully resigned from office. ECOWAS decided to grant legitimacy now. But African Union insisted, no, it's not enough to resign from office. You also need to conduct elections. We want to see you conduct elections. So in this case, the guy that was in office was confused because, do I work with the ECOWAS legitimacy granted to me, or the African Union that doesn't want to grant me legitimacy? So there was a lot of pull and push in that process, and it ended up in a whole disgrace internationally because the elections were organized eventually, but they were marred by irregularities. And something similar also happened in Ivory Coast, as I conclude them. In 2010, with the popular case of Laurent Gbagbo and Ouattara, where Gbagbo lost the election and he refused to relinquish power. ECOWAS came on live TV and said they were going to intervene in Ivory Coast. But the African Union didn't support that move, even the United Nations too. So everything the ECOWAS did to intervene in Ivory Coast failed. And it was just like a case of a paper tiger, a paper tiger that is only That's only powerful in principle, but not in actuality. So that was also a very big disgrace for for ECOWAS, because there was no collaboration, harmonization of policies between ECOWAS and the African Union Peace and Security Council. But although eventually the African Union Peace and Security Council gave a go-ahead, but it wasn't for ECOWAS to intervene. It was for French forces to collaborate with the Ouattara forces to remove the government of Laurent Gbagbo. And with this, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Njoku. That was a really amazing session. Thank you so much. Although we are quite pressed for time, but I would take just one question. So does anyone have a question for Mr. Njoku? You can just unmute yourself if you have a question for him.
Yeah, I think I have a question.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Mr. Emmanuel, for the presentation. That was insightful. Okay. I would like to ask him, aside from the efforts of the African Union in trying to tackle unconstitutional changes of government in Africa, so don't you think that I want to ask him, is there anything also, don't you think that the African Union can go further in trying to tackle the quality of the quality of democracy and governance in Africa? Maybe that could also, stem down the tide of this CUG that you have, or UCG you have in Africa. So did you get the question? Like, yes, the African Union, can it take an effort further in trying to tackle the quality of governance and then the democracy we practice in Africa here?
Okay, thank you very much, Oluwaseun. Thank you very much for that question. So, while preparing for this presentation today, I asked myself this question too, like, is there anything we can do? Because most of our measures seem to be, reactive as opposed to being preventive, because, there are factors that actually, motivate coups. You see, there are factors that, when coup plotters or coup makers come on live TV, there are things that they always say, a very common denominator in their statements, which is that you see things like the lack of bad governance, for example, economy dwindling, and then another very popular one is that the president was trying to overstay his constitutional mandate, things like that. So I was asking myself, what can we do as the African Union to prevent these from happening, as opposed to reacting to it? And there are a list of things we can do, but we also have to acknowledge the structural or even the inherent challenges within the African Union. The inherent challenges in the sense that if you read the Constitutive Act of the African Union, it looks like a very ambitious document that shows that, okay, we want democracy, we want good governance, we want respect for human rights, we want to get rid of or want to do away with, conflicts in Africa, we want governments, we want regular elections and all that stuff. It's a very, very ambitious document. But at the foundation of the formation of the African Union or the establishment of the African Union, you see that the African Union came at a time when African governments didn't really care about the quality of governance. What the focus was in the 1960s when the OAU was established was the administration of government, number one, and number two, the act of helping other African states to achieve independence. So because these are like newly independent states. So unlike the EU started with, okay, a few democratic states came together and they set up democracy and good governance at the foundation of the EU. So any state that wants to join the EU is automatically conditioned to subscribe to the ethos of democracy before they can, be part of this institution. So by virtue of being part of the EU, you have to already make a commitment to democracy and good governance. But the African Union, the only criteria for membership was that you are a member state of Africa. So now states joined the African Union with no regard for human rights. And it was just until the late 1970s, I think 75 particularly, or 74, when the African Charter on Human and People's Rights was established. And member states were like, no, this is not, we can't impose democracy and good governance on us because that wasn't the requirement to be part of this institution. We would choose if we want to practice these things or give us time to gradually adapt to this system, but you cannot impose it on us because that was never a criteria in the first place. And that's where we've struggled as African Union. We have things like, imposing implementing term limits within the African Union system. In fact, the Article 23.5 of the African Charter on the Democracy, Elections and Governance, it says that the African Union should work towards adopting a continentally binding instrument that imposes a term limit upon member states. So this one is not about whether or not your legal system recognizes term limits. This is African Union saying that although this thing has not been done since, although the Addis Ababa Charter came into force in 2012, and we are hopeful that in the future, this Article 23.5 would be given full effect to. But the issue of term limits being imposed from the continental level all the way to the national level, to the level of member states, is very, very important, because a factor that has precipitated unconstitutional change of government in Africa has always been one person sitting in power for too long, or one person trying to, or having changed the constitution to perpetuate himself in power beyond the ordinary constitutional mandate. And even some cases, they have removed completely the concept or the clause giving a term limit on the presidency. So these are things that have, caused coups in Africa. The African Union has this within the Addis Ababa Charter, but nothing has been done about it. And we are hoping that with this massive ratification of the Addis Ababa Charter, there would be the policy organs within the African Union would begin, measures to put this instrument talking about term limits in place. And of course, the African Union, there's very, very limited things we can do to member states, also because the African Union by nature is an intergovernmental organization as opposed to being a supranational organization like the EU. So we can't impose, we don't have like a sanction mechanism, so to speak, like a very well-developed or adequate sanction mechanism against member states that, carry out actions that are against the ideals of the African Union. Unlike the EU, if a coup happens within an EU country, they have well-established sanction mechanisms that would ensure that even before evening today, democratic government is restored within the EU member state. But we don't have it as African Union, because African Union is an intergovernmental organization in the sense that the member states are equals. So in the EU, to join the EU, you have to cede a portion of your sovereignty, just in layman's terms, you cede a portion of your sovereignty to be part of the European Union system. So in that case, the EU can impose sanctions on you, heavy sanctions on you, and the EU decisions are automatically adopted by member states without question. African Union is intergovernmental, it's not supranational. So our decisions, our treaties, our policies, it's almost like they are at the goodwill of member states. We can only use, diplomatic means to get them to comply. Okay, we have this Charter on Democracy. We want to, we use lobbying, for example, to get them to align. Sometimes also when we have a lot of states aligning, other states have no option than to align, but we don't have a sanction mechanism like the EU. And this also affects, of course, the human rights development in Africa, the fact that African Union doesn't have a sanction mechanism. So a lot of human rights decisions that we carry out within the African court system or African Commission system are not obeyed or complied with by the African states. So these are some challenges that we have, but these are also some things we could do, promoting ratification of the Addis Ababa Charter, and also looking at particularly the part that talks about term limits, Article 23.5, and giving effect to it by establishing a framework that would impose a continental term limit upon every African state. And as I conclude, it will interest you to know that there are actually African countries right now, even about 7 or more of them, that don't have anything like term limits in their constitution. So the president can stay there for life if he wants to. So these are things that we want to prevent by the establishment of this framework on term limits. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Oluwaseun, I think that accurately answered your question.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Njoku, that was really, really enlightening. Thank you so much. So we have come to the end of Mr. Njoku's session, and we are now moving towards the end of this meeting. So thank you very much for staying to this point. At this time, I would like to call on the Executive Director of the Lex Lata Center for International Law and Comparative Constitutionalism in Africa, Dr. Wale Kunuji, to give his closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Ewalua. Thank you very much, Ms. Lori and Mr. Njoko. That has been a very insightful, event today. The topic is a very important one, considering recent happenings across Africa, especially what we saw recently in Mali. We also saw this in other parts of Africa in the recent past, within the context of the so-called Arab Spring. One thing that I think has not been sufficiently explored in the literature on this subject is the issue of popular revolutions, the so-called popular revolutions, and their implications for democratic consolidation on the continent. So, for example, we saw this in Egypt when Hosni Mubarak was removed from office or was pressurized to resign, and he was replaced by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. We also saw this recently in Algeria, where Abdulaziz Bouteflika was also forced to resign. Now, the question is whether these so-called popular revolutions, in any way, do they confer legitimacy on the new governments? And I think this is what we should be looking at. Do these popular revolutions, to what extent do these popular revolutions confer legitimacy on the new governments? It's something that we need to look at. And another thing we need to look at is, if you look at the African Charter, the 2007 African Charter on democracy, elections, and good governance, it appears the vision of the framers of that charter was to have a situation where once you have an unconstitutional change of government, the next thing is to be looking in the direction of having fresh elections. But then the question is whether the African Union should not be insisting on restoring the status quo ante, because these unconstitutional changes of government have their very negative implications for the enhancement of the democratic process across Africa. So I think instead of saying, okay, let's have fresh elections after every unconstitutional change of government, what we should be saying is, let's go back to what we had before the unconstitutional change of government. That is, governments across Africa should only be removed through the ballot box and not through any other means, not through what you call popular revolutions. These are some of the things I think we should be looking at. These are some of the conversations I think we should be having around this subject going forward. I want us to be reflecting on this as we go on. I want to thank the speakers, Ms. Lori and Mr. Njoku, for their contributions. Thank you very much. That was very, very good. And I'm wondering why we're not having, this sort of event should actually have a lot of people attending to contribute to the conversation. But thank you very much. We appreciate you. And we hope that in future, when we invite you to attend other meetings like this, we will honor our invitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. That's something to reflect on. And today we have come to the end of this session. Thank you very much for coming, and I'm sure that you learned a thing or two. I hope to see you once again some other time. So thank you. Bye-bye.